In today's video, I'll be covering the first 3 games played during the latest SCG Standard Open. In order to keep the video short, I will only talk about the highlights during each game. You can always go to the SCG Twitch channel and watch the VOD if you want to see the entire games. I will be talking from my notes, meaning I will be giving my first impressions on the new standard, as I was watching the first 3 games during the live broadcast. And afterwards I will talk about if the top 8 results changed any of my thoughts or opinions. Alright, so let's get started with game number 1, and here we had Esper Midrange versus Simic Ramp. And this game was honestly quite slow. It had a few funny moments, but overall this game was slow. So first off, the Esper midrange player does manage to get 2 Hero of the Prescient 1 early on, but he doesn't manage to get any massive token army. I don't think he even got like 1 token early on. He eventually gets his Sorin as well onto the field, but at this point he has nothing in his graveyard, so the Sorin is just sitting there dealing 1 damage. Meanwhile, the ramp doesn't get the fastest ramp, but he does eventually manage to get a Nissa. And with the Nissa, he's starting to slowly tick up towards the ultimate. He also managed to get one of his Ujin onto the board as well, but the game is really slow. And at this point, a random Oath of Kaya appears as well, but it doesn't have really any impact on this particular game at all. Eventually we make our way to turn number 6 and a Llanowar Elf does appear. So far the Esper midrange deck seems quite awful and slow, and the Nissa deck is somehow allowed to work because reasons. And Nissa does manage to get to her ultimate. Now the Esper midrange player has the Elder Spell, but he only has it in the sideboard, and overall he's lacking a lot of Planeswalker hate in the main board. To be honest, I would rather see a modern white deck than this very questionable Esper midrange deck. He does manage to resolve a Teferi, the Time Raveler, but the game is so slow and he has lost complete control, as well as the fact he doesn't really have many options to deal with his opponent's Planeswalkers, at least permanently. Anyway, let's move on. So with indestructible lands, the ramp player also resolves the new card and is able to fetch a Helm of the Host from his sideboard. And at this point the game gets kinda interesting because he tries to equip his Helm of the Host on one of his lands that are a 3/3. And at this point they have to call in the judge because they are not sure if he actually gets a 3/3 land from Helm of the Host or if he only gets a land. In the end, the judge rules that he only gets a land and he does not get a 3/3 creature land. They also have to make a ruling if they actually have to rewind the game slightly, because as I understood it, he tried to actually make a blocking with the land he has already made with the Helm of the Host, because the ruling came after the block, if I remember correctly. Eventually the game does go on, and on the next turn he managed to fetch a Meteor Golem with his card from the sideboard, and of course he's going to equip the Helm of the Host onto the Meteor Golem, meaning that each turn he can destroy a permanent on the field, and at this point the Esper midrange player had enough and does forfeit the game. In conclusion, this first game was very messy, but at the very least we did get a ruling on wherever the Helm of the Host will make a land or a 3/3 land, so I guess we got something out of the game. The sideboards are not too interesting. The ramp player has mainly one of artifacts for the card to fetch as toolbox and some enchantment hate. The Esper midrange player has the standard duress, some Planeswalker hate, and some common tool cards. Alright, so let's move on to game number 2. Now, game number 2 was also quite boring. One of the reasons were the fact that the Esper player did actually get mana screwed and stuck at 2 mana for some time, while the ramp player got a perfect ramp and managed to get 2 Nissas out. Obviously, the first Nissa died. Oh, and the Esper player did at one point forget a trigger for Hero of Prescient 1, so he didn't get a token. But somehow he did manage to stabilize to a certain degree. He got a Teferi the Time Reveler onto the board and bounced one of the annoying lands. But then a third Nissa happened, and from there on was kind of upward battles. Teferi went down, but he managed to find a Deputy of Detention to deal with the Nissa and make some awkward blocks. But then a 6/6 Hydroid Krasis came out, and at this point it was kinda game over. He found a second Deputy of Detention for the Hydroid Krasis, but the turn afterwards he had to do some really awkward blocking, and basically both Deputy of Detention died, Nissa came back, Hydroid Krasis came back. Obviously he died right away because he comes back as a 0/0, but there was nothing else the Esper player could do and he lost the game. In conclusion, the games were very one-sided, and to be honest, both decks looked very weak. They both seem to suffer from the same issue, and that is if anything goes wrong, everything goes wrong with the deck. They need that perfect curve, but more about that later. Alright, let's move on to the second match, and this one is between 4-color Dreadhorde and Rakdos Aggro. If you're not seen 4-color Dreadhorde, then let's go over it really quickly. Once you play the card Dreadhorde, you get to return creatures and planeswalkers from graveyards to the battlefield under your control. However, you have to pay the converted mana cost of the cards you return and pay it in life. So if you are low enough, you might not even have the chance to bring anything really reasonable back, or not bring enough back to actually make it matter. Obviously, the deck runs Wildgrowth Walkers together with some Explorer to be able to bring those back and gain a bunch of life. But again, if you're low enough, then you might actually not have that choice, or you might get at most maybe 2 Explore triggers and then die the next turn. And obviously, Rakdos Aggro just goes face and hopefully kills you before you are able to bring back all your important cards. So let's delve into the games. Well, the first game was really awkward. Obviously, the aggro player just went face, trying to bring him low enough to make the Dreadhorde actually not be a viable plan. He did manage to bring out a Spawn of Mayhem, but the Dreadhorde player was able to resolve a Dreadhorde and gain enough life and board presence to win the first match. Basically, the Explore life gain with a Wildgrowth Walker together with a Teferi on the board made the aggro player forfeit. He was never going to be able to actually come back from such a deficit. Just as with the questionable Nissa deck, the Dreadhorde deck appeared to be just too reliant on everything going right and nothing going wrong. And if your opponent has any kind of graveyard hate, you might as well forfeit, unless you get that perfect Wildgrowth Walker into Explorer start. Alright, so let's move on to the second round, and as I already said, I really don't like these one-dimensional decks, because when something goes wrong, well, it just falls apart, and in the second round, well, it went just wrong. First off, the aggro player got a much better hand and was able to pressure much harder early on, as well as the Dreadhorde player got a very slow hand and didn't really do anything the entire game. He did eventually resolve a Massacre Girl, killing himself because there was a Judith on the board, so when the aggro player's 2 creature died, it pinged him for 2 and he fell over. Let's go to game number 3. So game number 3, another very awkward game. The aggro player got mana screwed, but the Dreadhorde player lacked the right colors, and 3 duress happened very early on from the sideboard for the aggro player, leading to a top deck war, which in my opinion top deck wars are really boring to watch because it's not really about skill, it's just whoever gets the best top deck that wins. And eventually the aggro player did win the top deck war. In conclusion, as I was saying in the beginning, Dreadhorde just looks really awful when something goes wrong. And yeah, things went wrong for it quite a lot. The deck is just not very consistent, and mono blue with a standard hand would tear it apart. Let's move on to the next round. But before the next round, there were a quick time shifted match, aka a recorded round from another table sped up. To be honest, not much to say about the time-shifted match. A Phoenix deck ran over a questionable white-green-blue deck, almost winning a game where the Phoenix deck had to mulligan down to 4 cards, only missing 1 damage to go for lethal. That was quite interesting to see. Anyway, to no one's surprise, the Phoenix deck is still viable in Standard and still a really decent deck. Let's move on to round number 3. And for our final match, we get a Nexus of Fate against Grixis Control. Yeah, sorry about that. Let's try to make this fast. So first off, we get a very early search for Azcanta from the Nexus of Fate player, followed by a Wilderness Reclamation that managed to resolve. And that kind of spells the end for the whole first game. Grixis Control does not have that much enchantment removal, and of course there's no Teferi there to bounce anything either to counter it later on. However, he tries for a little bit to fight it. He managed to bring down a Nicholas Bolas. This is the old Bolas, not the new one that is a Planeswalker already. The old one is a dragon first, then he turns into a Planeswalker. And after dealing with a Tamiyo, Thought Erasure reveals a quite weak Nexus of Fate hand, so for a time the Grixis Control player does manage to stabilize the game. However, Nexus managed to flip Search for Azcanta and start getting all the pieces to get Nexus of Fate going, which leads to the Grixis player forfeiting game number 1. We all know that once Nexus of Fate gets going, there is not much you can do. You can pretty much go AFK. Anyway, let's move on to the second game of the third round. An early duress from the Grixis Control player reveals a decent Nexus of Fate hand, but an Elspell managed to deal with the early Planeswalker threat from the Nexus deck. However, a Wilderness Reclamation managed to resolve once again, and a very boring mid-game follows. Thankfully, a third Tamiyo managed to resolve from the Nexus of Fate player with only a Bolas as a response. And the next turn, the Nexus of Fate player managed to actually draw the Nexus of Fate, and thankfully for everyone involved, the Grixis Control player does forfeit the game at this point because he knew it was kinda over. That saved us quite a lot of time. This was actually, I think, the quickest one of the first rounds that were streamed, which was quite fortunate. I don't think anyone was looking forward to watching Nexus of Fate doing its thing for an extended period of time, so thank you for that. In conclusion, Nexus of Fate is still as annoying as ever in Standard and not very fun for anyone involved, especially not playing against. Still, the deck is very consistent. However, do remember that Nexus of Fate is banned in Best of 1 in MTG Arena, so if you're gonna make the deck, you are gonna have to go for Best of 3s. When it comes to this new Grixis Control deck, I was not sold at all. It looked very questionable with some glaring weakness compared to more established control decks. Alright, since the previous match was quite fast, I will be covering the next one as well, because this one was a time-shifted match and was between mono-red and green-white tokens, both decks being very similar to what we are used to from Ravnica Allegiances. In the first game, the mono-red player had quite a good start, but was not able to keep up the pressure, and eventually 2 Loxodon after each other spelled the end for round number 1. Oh, and a Chandra showed why you would rather have Experimental Frenzy as well. Just didn't do anything useful in the end, unlike an Experimental Frenzy which would probably have won the game for the mono-red deck. The second game was quite a whitewash. The mono-red deck had quite a slow hand and ended up facing 2 Thorn Lieutenants followed by Tristiani, and after that it was game over. So those were my notes from the first 3 rounds of the SCG Standard Open, plus 2 time-shifted matches. Did any of my thoughts during the first few rounds change after the weekend was over? In short, no. As I said in the top 8 deck review, my only real surprise were the lack of Planeswalker removal cards from the majority of the non-Super Friend decks. I am really looking forward to the next SCG Standard and see how the players will adjust to the massive numbers of Super Friend decks that were present during the last weekend's SCG Standard. Anyway, I will catch you later. This is Project signing out.